You want to be partners?
Of course.
Put the gun down. That looks real, right?
Tim, you brought the doorman. This is like a joke, right? Are you really that late?
Dean Carney is a man from Las Vegas, born into a middle-class family. Despite their limited means, his parents made every effort to provide him with a top-tier education, including sending him to Harvard High School, an elite school known for catering to wealthy students. There, Dean met Joe, a student who attended on a scholarship. Although both came from modest backgrounds, their personalities differed significantly. Dean was outgoing, clever, and easily won over the wealthy kids, while Joe preferred to stay to himself. In July 1983, 6 years after graduating, Dean visited a cafe to sell his friend Kyle's luxury car. By chance, Joe was there too, and they caught up on their lives. Dean was still living off manipulating wealthy acquaintances, while Joe worked as a stock salesman earning a modest salary. Joe wanted to start his own business, but lacked both connections and capital. Hearing Joe's situation, Dean saw an opportunity for them to team up. Confident in their chances, he suggested they work together, leveraging Dean's rich contacts to help Joe attract investors. That evening, Dean invited Joe to Charlie's birthday party, hoping Joe could pitch his investment idea. At first, Joe was hesitant. Charlie and his friends had bullied him in high school, but Dean convinced him this was a rare opportunity. At the party, Joe was stunned by the wealth and extravagance of the Beverly Hills crowd. He noticed Dean effortlessly mingling, including with a woman named Shim Evans. Joe tried to introduce himself to her but was ignored. Soon they met Charlie and the Biltmore brothers, Kyle and Scott, and Joe presented his gold stock investment pitch. Charlie immediately dismissed it, claiming he already knew gold prices would drop, while Kyle recognized Joe from high school. The pitch failed and Joe left feeling hopeless about partnering with Dean. That night, inspired by a magazine story about Steve Jobs, Joe devised a new strategy and mindset. He realized rich kids valued recognition over technical knowledge. Dean agreed and gave him $10,000 as initial capital. An apology from Kyle he hoped Joe could double to impress Charlie and the others. Joe invested in gold stocks and in just 3 weeks earned a 35% profit. He carefully tracked the market, preparing for the moment they would present the results to Charlie and friends. On the way, Dean stopped to deliver expensive wheels to Ron Levin, a retired stock player now managing tenders for the wealthy. Joe read the stock news and panicked. Gold had suddenly dropped. Ron immediately suspected a loss, but Joe stayed calm, claiming he had withdrawn the stocks. When they arrived at Charlie's house, Joe told Dean they had lost 50% of their investment and planned to return the remaining $5,000 to Kyle. Dean was shocked. He thought the $10,000 was apology money, but it was actually from selling Kyle's car. The two argued, but Dean insisted the presentation had to go on. It was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. Once the investors gathered, Dean began the presentation while Joe, thinking about his losses, decided to take a big risk. He confidently pitched the business, framing the opportunity as a chance to surpass their father's success and gain respect. He gave Kyle a check for $5,000 as proof of profit, while the remaining $10,000 stayed invested in gold stocks. Kyle, initially upset that his money had been used without permission, accepted it after seeing the check and even invited Joe out for dinner. That evening, Joe and Dean went to Spago, an upscale Beverly Hills restaurant. Dean led most of the conversation, presenting Joe as a man with vision and potential. During their meal, a waiter delivered an expensive bottle of wine, an unexpected gift from Ron, who was dining with artist Andy Warhol. Joe greeted Ron, and after a brief conversation, Ron even gave Joe his autograph on a candy bar, which Joe accepted enthusiastically. Meanwhile, Kyle and Scott grew excited about joining BBC, imagining quick profits without much effort. Before leaving, each of them invested $80,000 into Joe's business. Joe used part of the funds to purchase a luxury car from Germany for $10,000, which he resold for $80,000. Kyle, Scott, and Charlie were the first to see the car before it went to the dealership. Joe also took a car to Ron's house to showcase BBC's growth, hoping to secure his investment. However, Ron remained unimpressed, stating that he would only invest once Joe demonstrated profits in the hundreds of thousands. Ron also shared his past experience with the SEC and why he left the stock world, explaining that his actions were legal but risky. Over time, BBC expanded as Scott, Charlie, and Kyle joined Joe in recruiting new investors. They targeted experienced business people who were difficult to persuade, but were eventually convinced by the rapid profits. Some of the money was used to build a luxurious office to make the business appear legitimate. Ron eventually decided to invest in gold stocks through BBC, although he used his own broker, with profits to be divided later. Joe contacted Ron's broker, Frank, to confirm BBC's account balance. Shocked by the total, he immediately put it on speakerphone for everyone, who were all amazed to hear BBC's accounts had reached $4 million. Ron reminded them to handle the funds carefully. Shortly after, one investor, Dexter, received his first 50% profit. Initially hesitant, Dexter now trusted BBC, tore up his profit check, and issued a new one for $167,000, representing his savings for retirement and his children's tuition. Joe grew nervous, realizing that larger investments meant greater responsibility. Dean reminded Joe that returning the funds would ruin everything, emphasizing the promise of a 50% profit every 3 weeks to all investors. The following day, Joe unexpectedly met Sydney, the woman who had ignored him at the party. This time, he confidently introduced himself and they began talking, sharing stories about their lives. Their connection grew stronger and Sydney invited Joe to her senior art exhibition that evening. Without hesitation, Joe accepted, wanting to make a good impression. He bought an expensive suit, surprising his father, who asked where he got the money. Joe explained that his business was growing and that he planned to buy a new house soon. His father cautioned him that no honest business succeeds instantly, but Joe remained confident. Meanwhile, Sydney was scolded by her boss for a perceived mistake at work. Joe comforted her and offered to help solve her problems that night. Their support for each other gradually developed into a romantic relationship. A few days later, Joe and Dean were preparing to sign a massive deal worth $250 million. Joe planned to use the funds to pay off $3 million, owed by a coal company called Cogenco Energy, leveraging Ron's investment in BBC to appear influential. To ensure his safety, he hired a bodyguard named Tim. Before leaving for Chicago, Joe attended a discussion forum with Cogenco Energy's shareholders and staff. Upon arrival, he presented the BBC's plan to cover all debts and revitalize the company. That evening, Joe captured the shareholders' attention, and they agreed to merge Cogenco Energy into BBC, promising him a $250 million opportunity. A few weeks later, after the Cogenco Energy deal was finalized, Joe planned to buy a luxury house. Dean, however, was worried because no new investors had come in, and they still needed to pay profits to previous investors. Joe stayed calm, confident that Ron would transfer gold stock profits through his broker, and that the Cogenco Energy merger would bring in shareholder funds. Gradually, Dean's worries eased as he enjoyed the comforts of the new luxurious house. Joe invited Sydney to move in with him, and the house also became a gathering spot for Christmas celebrations. Everyone seemed happy, enjoying the party's excitement, unaware that Joe was beginning to struggle to pay investor profits. It turned out Ron hadn't sent BBC's shares yet. When pressed, Ron said he had instructed his broker to transfer the money that night. Joe immediately faced pressure as Charlie, Kyle, and Scott demanded their father's profits be paid. To delay their concerns, Joe gave each of them $500,000 in stock, temporarily diverting attention from the missing funds. At the same time, Ron sent Joe and Dean Rolex watches to congratulate them on BBC's growth, making them feel successful and reassured. They celebrated the Christmas party into the early morning, feeling triumphant. However, behind the festivities, the BBC finances were precarious. Joe later called Frank to check on the profits from Ron, only to realize that Frank's reports were fabricated. The truth came out. Ron had been deceiving him all along. The reported investments were part of a staged narrative, and Ron had used BBC's name to borrow $1.5 million from the bank. Joe and the team felt completely cheated, realizing Ron was under triple state surveillance for financial crimes. Furious and frustrated, Joe knew that without Ron's money, the Cogenco Energy deal could fail, leaving BBC unable to pay all investors. Joe was furious at Sydney for not warning him, but she tried to calm him by suggesting a vacation. Joe refused, insisting he had to take responsibility and repay all the investors. He, Dean, Charlie, Kyle, and Scott began plotting revenge against Ron. Dean argued it was time to teach Ron a lesson, as the con man was unlikely to go to the authorities. Each team member shared ideas on how to punish Ron, which Joe carefully noted. That evening, Joe and Tim went to Ron's house. Joe warned Tim to use force if necessary to retrieve the money. Once inside, Joe explained they were being pressured by investors. Tim revealed himself, and Ron, laughing at being threatened by a black man, underestimated them. Offended, Tim shot Ron in the head. Amid the chaos, Joe informed Dean of what had happened. Dean reassured him, saying Ron deserved it, and suggested claiming Ron had gone to New York to visit Cogenco Energy. Joe and Tim transported Ron's body to Soledad Canyon in Los Angeles. They ensured it wouldn't be recognized by pouring acid over it. Meanwhile, attempts to cash the check were rejected, worrying Dean about potential SEC and tax investigations. The authorities could trace Ron's name and involve the FBI, but Joe and his team worked to maintain BBC. They contacted Izzy, a friend of Charlie, who promised to invest $1 million if they helped smuggle his father from Iran, whose accounts were frozen. On July 30th, 1984, Joe and Dean began the smuggling operation using a large crate. Izzy's father initially refused, but after overdosing on opium, they placed him in the crate and transported him to LA. Dean feared he had died, but Tim confirmed he was still alive. While waiting for Izzy's father to recover, Joe tried to convince Sydney to fly to another city to help, but she refused due to her art exhibition. They argued, and meanwhile, many investors at BBC demanded their money back. Kyle and Scott, unable to handle the pressure, left the company. Dean continued monitoring Izzy's father, who woke up unexpectedly and attacked him. Joe arrived just in time to stop the fight and tied Izzy's father to prevent further rebellion. When Izzy's father tried to call for help, Dean strangled him to death without hesitation. Joe and Dean then discussed how to fake Izzy's father's death convincingly. Dean suggested desert disposal and handing over cremation to Izzy. Joe felt everything was spiraling out of control, but agreed, planning to return investors' money and quit once the funds were recovered. That night, Joe returned to his father's house, embarrassed, and asked for his father's help to witness the disbursement of Izzy's father's check. He admitted silently that his father had been right all along, and that he wanted to end the chaos. Meanwhile, Dean, under the influence of drugs, argued with Sidney and accidentally mentioned Ron's name, making Sidney suspicious. Seeing Dean's erratic behavior and feeling hurt, Sidney decided to leave the house. 2 days later, when Joe and Izzy tried to cash the check, police arrived to arrest Joe on murder charges. Joe resigned to his fate while his father promised to hire the best lawyer to defend him. It was revealed that Sidney, upset after the argument with Dean, reported the events to authorities. The investigation exposed not only BBC as a fraudulent stock company, but also the murders of Ron and Izzy's father. Dean became the main witness in all the cases. He carefully recounted the chronology of events to the investigators, but cleverly omitted the murders he had committed himself. Using his charm and ability to manipulate, Dean portrayed himself as just an ordinary worker, while framing Joe as the mastermind behind the fraud and the murders. He presented the list of revenge plans that Joe had written, claiming that Joe alone was responsible for the criminal actions, including the kidnapping and extortion involving Izzy's father. Dean's account was convincing, and when combined with the physical evidence, the police believed him completely. Joe, meanwhile, was left in despair, realizing that his best friend had betrayed him. Dean's manipulation ensured that he was seen as a credible, helpful witness, while Joe was branded as the mastermind and murderer. With Dean's testimony accepted, Joe was arrested and charged with multiple crimes, including fraud, murder, and extortion. Despite his protests, the evidence, combined with Dean's detailed account, made him appear guilty in the eyes of the law. Dean, on the other hand, was placed into the witness protection program for his safety. His identity changed, and he lived under government protection, free from any legal consequences. His cunning had allowed him to escape punishment entirely. Joe was sentenced to life in prison for the murders of Ron and Izzy's father, as well as for his involvement in the BBC scam. The film ends on a cautionary note. Trusting the wrong people can lead to betrayal, and shortcuts to success often come with irreversible consequences. It leaves viewers with the moral that true success requires patience, careful planning, and choosing allies wisely. Make sure to like and subscribe for more videos like this. Thanks for watching.